Hello, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to get started in just another minute. I wanted to give folks as much time as possible to be able to log in, so we'll get started in another 30 seconds. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Kiana Nurse. I'm the Senior Program Officer of IDEA Programs, which is still a relatively new unit at ACLS, which stands for Intentional Design for an Equitable Academy. I'm joined by my colleague today, Katie Rice, who is the program coordinator for IDEA Programs and will be managing the tech behind the scenes. So as the program lead for the Digital Justice Grant program, I'm very happy to kick off our fifth and also our final competition with this general information session, where hopefully all of your questions about the application, the eligibility requirements, and the evaluation criteria can be answered. It's been a real pleasure to steward this program as it has morphed and evolved over the past 5 years, and relatedly to navigate the growing interest in it. So I feel particularly humbled and honored to be able to sunset the program, especially as more people have expressed interest in it. So as always, this session will be recorded so that those with scheduling conflicts, or if you'd like to share this with additional team members, can still access the materials. So as I mentioned, today's general information session encompasses a mix of discussion about both the ethos of the ACLS Digital Justice Grants program, but also explaining some of the finer details of this year's competition, especially for those who may be new or applying for the first time. So after defining the vision for it by uplifting some of the recently funded projects, I'll then explain some key details about eligibility, including the difference between the seed and development grants. I'll give you all an overview of the application components, highlight some resources that are meant to assist you as you craft your application should you decide to apply, and then finally review the competition deadline before concluding with a Q&A. So given the volume of participants today, there were over 100 folks registered as of this morning. We will use Zoom's Q&A feature that my colleague Katie will be monitoring. So please post your questions there throughout the session and be sure to upvote the questions that you would like to see answered. Obviously, we won't have time to get to everyone's individual inquiries, but I do hope that I can answer questions that many people have in common. I would also encourage you to try to frame your questions, at least for now, as generally as possible. So that way everyone sort of listening in can benefit from hearing the question and also hearing the answer. If you have specific questions or concerns about your individual project, I'll explain how best to get in touch with us about that to receive additional information and feedback. So let's begin with the focus and ethos of the ACLS Digital Justice Grants program. And I want to start here in order to underscore the specificity of what that name digital justice means within ACLS and within the context of this program specifically. You know, I often get the question of what's the difference between a digital justice project and a digital humanities project when people are thinking about whether or not their project will be a good fit for this program. And so I hope by beginning with the program's focus and ethos, that difference between the two will become clear. So I'd also like to add the caveat that this isn't an exhaustive definitional effort, right? I'm not defining, the incredibly complicated and multifaceted term digital justice, or talking about how the term is used in other spaces. We're really just offering this definition as a way of making plain why and how we mobilize a particular aspirational and also reparative spirit of justice in the very name of the program, and how that is made manifest through digital tools and methods so that you have a better sense of whether or not, again, your project would be a good fit for submitting an application. So I assume that if you registered for this session, you're at the very least familiar with the basic thematic focus of the program and read through the description of it on the ACLS webpage. And so the focus of the program is that it specifically funds digital projects in the humanities and social sciences that critically engage with the histories and interests of people of color and other marginalized groups through the ethical and intentional use of digital tools and methods. But I'd like to highlight the definitional work this framing does for us, right? It positions digital justice as both a process and an outcome with a specific thematic focus. And in terms of the projects that have been funded over the years, that has ranged from Indigenous data sovereignty, Black cultural feminism, to environmental reparations, just to cite a few examples. And it's also coupled with a methodological imperative, which has reflected a similar diversity in the projects that we funded in terms of, for example, developing equitable workflows for using language models to redact sensitive information in archives, to training independent scholars to digitize and make publicly accessible primary sources about slavery in the US Northeast. And so the thematic focus, as well as the methodological imperative, that we've seen a wide spectrum of different projects that have been funded through the program that sort of heed this call. So because we position digital justice as both process and outcome in this way, and our commitment to that framing itself, reflects a very intentional and historically informed, and I would also argue reparatively oriented grant-making design process, the projects that are funded advance equity and justice in the digital domain, not simply through their content, but also in their methods, right? So the digital technologies are actually central to these projects' analyses and interventions within things like the ongoing legacies of racial capitalism, colonialism, and heteronormativity, among others. And so beyond this link between form and content, process and outcome, funded digital justice projects also demonstrate the greatest potential for advancing the program's other priorities. And these include cultivating a greater openness to new sources of knowledge and strategic approaches to content building and knowledge dissemination, engaging in appropriately scaled capacity building efforts. And these can include, but they're certainly not limited to, pedagogical projects that train students in digital humanities methods as a key feature of the project's content building practice. It can look like publicly engaged projects that develop new technological infrastructure with community partners. And it can also look like trans-institutional projects that connect scholars across different academic and cultural heritage institutions. So this thread of capacity building, and I've said this, in previous years, and I will continue to say it again for this final competition, the thread of capacity building, the spirit of it, is really in service of prompting applicants to give a more granular understanding of the context in which they pursue their work so that our reviewers can evaluate projects and applications based on where the funds might have the most impact insofar as, bolstering the creation of digital humanities scholarship. So I say that to say we don't at all expect applicants to articulate how their projects will solve all the problems at their respective institutions or how they're going to sort of from scratch build capacity to do digital work in their respective institutions. As I said, we want to be attentive to scale here. But it is our hope that the prompts around capacity building can give, again, the reviewers a better sense of what it is you are navigating. And it also helps us, I might add, avoid a kind of philanthropic paternalism where ACLS decides what capacity building looks like for each project team. We'd much rather applicants express to us, their vision for capacity building that's very much grounded in the specificity of their local institutional context and communities. And so for seed grants, particularly, the scope of funded activities also includes, exploring or experimenting with new materials, methodologies, and research agendas by way of planning workshops, prototyping, or testing projects. And then for development grants, these are projects that engage in activities that really advance beyond that kind of prototyping or proof of concept phase. And, they do so by articulating the next financial, technological, or intellectual phase of the project's development. So for these last two sort of points, the difference between the seed grants and the development grants, I'm going to spend some time talking a little bit more extensively about that. But I did want to provide some examples of what the scope of funded activities can actually look like in different projects. So you have more of a concrete sense of what kinds of projects the program has funded. So the first example that I'd like to provide is the Advancing Digital Justice for Indigenous Stewardship in Ecuadorian Amazonia, which was awarded a Digital Justice Seed Grant in 2025. So this is led by a team of scholars in the US and the Amazonian Quechua in Ecuador. And this project uses digital mapping and storytelling methods to train youth in digital data technologies. So through this intergenerational training, the project team is co-creating digital data with their indigenous community partners about traditional ecological knowledge and senses of place, with the aim of fostering intergenerational relationships for long-term indigenous stewardship of riverine ecosystems. So the seed funding here will be used to purchase audiovisual equipment to support the project, ArcGIS licensing and transcription subscriptions, as well as honoraria for interviewee participants and travel for the project team, all of which, support the project activities of training youth in oral history collection and learning to use GIS, as well as developing the website where the story maps will ultimately be housed. So in terms of outcomes and digital deliverables, there are some relatively straightforward ones, right, like the website itself. But this project also demonstrates the value of process documentation as an important outcome, especially at the seed phase. So process documentation offers even so-called, quote unquote, failures or challenges as valuable parts of the project and sets the project up as an asset for other folks interested in doing similar kinds of work. But importantly for our purposes here, in terms of also underscoring how this fits within the broader sort of ACLS Digital Justice Program parameters, the process documentation and the data training also positions this project as part of kind of a larger, multifaceted effort at capacity building. And so within the parameters of this project, that capacity building, again, is defined through, I think, countering the loss of traditional knowledge through intergenerational knowledge transfer, but one that's also grounded in a practice of data sovereignty. So the next example, the Archaeological Archives as Inclusive Learning Laboratories, was awarded a development grant in 2025. So this project is led by a transnational team spanning the US, the UK, and Syria. And it aims to make archaeological archives, particularly those of the American excavation site at Dura Europos in Syria, more accessible to a wider range of users by introducing local perspectives and affordances. So the team will be using their development grant for a few activities. The first is a digital upskilling of displaced and local Middle Eastern heritage professional descendant communities and students. The second is conducting oral history interviews with communities local to the Dura Europos site. The third is adding those completed oral histories to archives, and that new digital content will then be digitally networked with existing archival materials. And then finally, expanding and correcting institutionally received metadata. So in doing so, this project really expands on prior work that was funded by the NEH and the Open Societies University Network to create the archive the team is now making more accessible, and to do some of that relationship building via skills training in linked open data methods with Syrian cultural heritage professionals. And so for our purposes, I again want to highlight that the relationship between process and outcome in this project's vision of digital justice. So the outcomes are the digital archives that disrupt those kind of colonial legacies of traditional archaeological archives and unbalanced processes of knowledge making. And the process for getting there involves leveraging digital tools such as the multilingual Wikimedia ecosystem and linked open data methods to do so. But the capacity building efforts are also central to that work. So now that I've spoken a little bit about the big picture vision and intention of the program and provided some examples of the sort of scope of different funded activities, I'll transition into reviewing some of the concrete details of this competition and application that might be helpful to you as you craft your materials. The first detail is, of course, determining if your project is eligible for consideration. So the first eligibility requirement is that at least one of the principal investigators must be a scholar in the humanities. So as I have said in previous years, during the pilot year, we received a lot of inquiries about what this meant, particularly whether or not we were limiting our definition of scholar to those with PhDs or faculty positions. We are not. So given the very collaborative nature of digital work, especially the extent to which librarians and archivists are often at the center of some of these projects and the ways in which graduate students partner with faculty members, I want to make clear that our definition of a scholar for this program is one with a demonstrated track record of engagement in scholarly debates and communities, whether that is by publications, conference presentations, or collaborations with other scholars, both in and outside of their fields. So it's not limited to professional title or credential. This is a more holistic approach to eligibility that has made it such that the number of advanced graduate students, postdocs, and librarians have been PIs and co-PIs on funded projects. So the second eligibility requirement is about the extent to which project teams agree to make their content publicly accessible. So this used to be in the form of the intellectual property agreement, which was a separate kind of application component. We have folded this into the eligibility requirements now to pare down the application packets that our reviewers receive. So as you are going through and setting up your common profile in the ACLS OFA system, you'll also be asked this question and asked to agree to these terms as part of the eligibility screening process. So the final eligibility requirement is that an institution of higher education in the US must administer awarded grant funds. So if you're not formally affiliated with an institution, I recommend partnering with someone who is, and in any case, the strongest applications always feature a project team rather than individual scholars. It is also the case that we've had projects funded where the teams are transnational. And so there's usually one PI based at a US institution of higher ed, and then other scholars or other sort of community partners based internationally. And they're able to kind of distribute funds through the US based institution that way. So it doesn't at all make you ineligible if you have project team members that are not based in the US, but you do need to have at least one of the project members be based there so that we can distribute the funds accordingly. So the three eligibility requirements that I just described apply to both seed and development grants, but there is one requirement between the two that varies, and that's about assessing what phase of development your project is in. So seed grants, as the name implies, are for startup projects that are in the prototyping or proof of concept phase. And by contrast, development grants must demonstrate significant preliminary work, right? As well as a record of engagement with public and or scholarly audiences. So given this distinction between the two, you may be wondering, which grant should I apply for? Is my project a better fit for a seed grant, or is my project a better fit for a development grant? So we have here some very basic, but by no means exhaustive or prescriptive considerations that may help you determine which of the grants is the best fit for your project. So in terms of technology, you can ask yourself about the extent to which your project has already tested the software, hardware, or digital projects featured in the project, and the extent to which the entirety of the funded activities or the proposed activities would be doing that testing, right? So if you have not done that testing, and this is your first go at it, that's a good indication that you should apply for a seed grant. If you've already done some of that testing and have a clear rationale behind why you're using a specific tool or platform, that may be an indication that a development grant is a better fit. So the same principle applies to human relationships and partnerships necessary to carry out this work, both on your campus or off it. So if you've already identified them and developed those partnerships, you can ask yourself, well, what work have you already done together, right? So if you can confidently speak to the nature of the relationship, how long it's lasted, what kind of work have you already done, and also how that relationship is going to inform the proposed activities that you are including in the application for this new phase of the project's life, that is a good indication that perhaps a development grant is a better fit. So finally, you can also consider the project's history, engaging with public and/or scholarly audiences. So you can cite and describe publications, exhibits, events, websites, apps, anything of that sort that has connected your project with an audience. This is also a good indication that you should apply for a development grant. Even as you look at the prompts for the application, which I'll talk about in just a minute, you'll notice that there's a slight difference in terms of the types of questions that we ask for seed grants versus development grants. And one of the differences is in the project history. So if you can sort of easily answer that question around what the project has done up until this point, again, that's a good indication that the development grant may be a better fit. So I want to note that although I framed the answers to these questions as a binary yes, no, I do recognize that most of these answers will exist on a spectrum, and that you'll have to use your own discernment about where on the spectrum, the nuances and history of your project live. So if you have any doubts about which grant type might be better suited for your project, please attend an ACLS office hour, which again, I'll talk about towards the end of this presentation, or send us an email, and we'll be happy to point you in the right direction. So to further illustrate this difference between seed projects and development projects, I'm going to give some additional concrete examples of projects that have been funded. So you can also see the diversity of activities that go into a digital justice project, but again, sort of thinking a little bit more concretely about where your project may be best positioned in terms of applying for a seed or a development grant. So the first seed grant that I'd like to highlight is Stabilizing Futures, Mapping Housing Loss with AI, which was awarded a seed grant in 2025 as part of the University of Florida's AI Climate Justice Lab, and in collaboration with the think tank New America and Bright Community Trust. So this project collects data related to climate-induced housing instability in Central Florida, leveraging AI functionalities to streamline the collection, cleaning, and analysis of the data. This is ultimately geared towards an interactive website where both policymakers and the communities impacted by climate-induced housing instability can deduce new actionable insights from the data to ultimately intervene and prevent housing loss. The seed funding will be used to fund undergraduates who will assist with data processing and prototyping, travel, as well as subawards to the community partners here to largely supervise and direct the data collection, analysis, podcast development, and report drafting. And what's important to note here is that this project is largely oriented towards data collection and processing. So even though the relationships with community partners were already in place, this project is a good demonstration, I think, of a seed project, since, as we all know, oftentimes the first and most critical step for establishing a proof of concept is data collection. So by contrast, we have the Black Lunch Table Digital Archive, or BLT for short, which was awarded a development grant in 2025. Some of you may be familiar with this longstanding project. It's a 20-year digital archive at this point, which at the time that this team submitted their proposal contained open access, born digital collection of images, transcriptions, and over 800 hours of recorded roundtable conversations featuring over 1,200 Black artists, art workers, and community members across the US, Canada, and South Africa. So the team is using their development grant to make their entire repository available for research and use, including developing a prior prototype of a web-based multimedia application, installing a preservation quality backend and digital asset management system to structure and organize the data, and increasing the availability of the BLT dataset in multiple linked open data formats. So when you compare this project with the former one, the difference between, I think, seed and development grants become a little clearer. Whereas that last project, which was focused on data collection and processing, this project already has a well-established repository of data. And that means that the activities are largely around making the archive more accessible to larger communities of practice and audiences. Also, given that this project is, over 20 years old, the project team was able to provide a plethora of examples about the project history in a way that a seed project might not be able to do. So once you've determined if you're eligible to apply and decide which grant type, seed or development is the best fit for you, you'll then need to actually complete and submit the application. So both the seed and development grants have the same application components, which include elements such as the bibliography, the project timeline, the project budget and budget description, project staffing, and also the institutional verification. So the components coded in orange were introduced in 2024, which I'll review for those who are new to the program and new to applying for the first time. So in prior years, and also this is the case with other ACLS programs, we tend to ask for a certain page defined proposal narrative, which comprises the bulk of the application. And so this was the space where applicants described, the intellectual ambitions of the project and also detailed the new activities that grant funds would support. So they'd provide a narrative of what those look like. In 2024, we replaced that model with a series of discrete prompts with word count limits rather than with page count limits. Although if you were to add up the word count limits for each of the prompts, you would approximate what we were asking previously in terms of the number of pages. So there are a few reasons why we shifted to this structure. So for starters, our previous reviewers, they did offer some feedback about the structure of the application and also about the kind of information they wanted to be able to more readily access as they go through an application. And so the most significant insight that they offered was that applications often spent way too much time within the proposal narrative talking about the intellectual underpinnings of a project and not nearly enough time talking about the project's mechanics. So its tools, its methods, how you're actually going to operationalize the intellectual kind of vision that you set forth when you describe the project. And this is a sort of word of advice that I would offer to folks too, as they're thinking about how to frame their project. You want to spend as much time talking about how you're going to operationalize this project as you are talking about the kind of intellectual contributions that it offers. So what's interesting about this is that we also heard a similar concern from applicants during a focus group that we held in 2024 as well. So during those sessions, applicants very generously shared their experiences navigating the competition, offered some really helpful suggestions around how we might change the structure of the application so that folks are better positioned to actually provide the information that reviewers want and need in order to better advocate for their projects. So rather than sticking with the proposal narrative upload format, we have now shifted to this prompt-based model that asks very pointed questions about the different dimensions of your project. And this, I hope, will, and I have seen it now that we've done it for a couple of years now, but it does streamline the reading and evaluation process, since similar types of information are available in the same places across applications. But it also, I hope, makes completing the application a little bit more straightforward. And so the prompts with their word count limits will give you a better sense of how much space to allot to different dimensions of your project. And so you no longer have to guess or, better yet, simply know what those unstated, unwritten rules are about grant writing to dictate where you should put certain pieces of information about your project within a proposal. And another sort of quick piece of advice that I'd offer on that front is to, read the prompts and make sure that you're actually answering the question. It is fairly obvious when someone has written a narrative in a page format and then copied and pasted paragraphs according to that kind of flow into the prompts, right? So you want to make sure that you're actually putting the information in the places that asks for it with the specific prompts and what those prompts ask for. So aside from the specific application components, I do want to uplift that we are continuing to exclude formal letters of recommendation from the application. So over the past 3 competitions, we haven't had any reviewers report that their ability to evaluate applications was lessened because they didn't have letters. No one missed them. And so they did, however, recommend asking for brief statements of support from community partners if a project features them, right? So they wouldn't have to extrapolate the nature of that partnership based on the materials. So we began asking for those letters in 2024. So if your project features extramural community partners, you'll need to have them provide a very brief, no more than 1-page, double-spaced letter of support that details the nature of the partnership. And I want to emphasize partnership, right? Insofar as these are folks who are co-creators of the project, they have an equal intellectual ownership of the data and the other digital outputs of the project, and they are kind of true partners in that way. As they write the letter, they will describe kind of how long they have been working with the project team on this project, what kinds of activities or responsibilities they take care of in terms of the overall workflow of the project, where the project ultimately lives and how they're involved in that, just to give you a sense of what kind of information is included in those letters. I also say this to say you don't need to include letters from folks who operate more as contractors for the project. So folks like full stack developers, graphic designers, their contributions to the project are reflected in the budget and budget narrative. So if you're using grant funds to kind of outsource, especially some of the more technical dimensions of the project, you don't need a letter of support from those folks. So for those projects with multiple community partners, we welcome up to 3 distinct letters, and you may also submit them in their original language if that's applicable, but you'll need to accompany them with an English translation. The last thing I would like to underscore with respect to the application itself is the institutional verification, because we get questions about this every year. So again, I just want to reiterate, it is not a formal letter of recommendation. It's a form that should take no more than 20 minutes to complete, and we note in the instructions that are sent to the administrators who will submit this on your behalf. We let them know that it shouldn't take very long. So the form asks them to confirm that the grant funds will be distributed through their institution, that any activities done for the grant can be counted for tenure and promotion, and that the grantees can use any available tech infrastructure at their institution for their projects. So it's a series of 3 check boxes that we ask people to, check to confirm that those things are true. And then also there is a kind of brief write-in area where they can provide additional detail about the kinds of resources that may be available for folks, although that is an optional write-in. We just ask for those 3 check marks to be, those are the required things that need to be confirmed. When you log into your application, again on the ACLS OFA portal, you're able to note the name and email of the administrator, and then our system automatically sends the invitation to that person to be able to complete and submit the institutional verification. So I highly recommend that the moment you decide that you're going to apply to this program, and as you're going through your application, to note that person in our system as soon as possible. Even though it only takes 20 minutes, it is often the case that folks leave this as the very last thing to do. And unfortunately, we can't accept that beyond the deadline. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But again, just wanted to flag that the institutional verification, it's not a formal letter of recommendation. So the key reminders here, again, we're asking you to answer a series of prompts. We're not asking you to write out a full narrative. There are no letters of recommendation at all in the application. And then, as I just said about the institutional verification, it's a very quick, 20-minute ordeal that we recommend you try to get completed as soon as possible. And then we are limiting the letters of community support to 3 letters maximum. So now that you have a sense of what the application is comprised of, I also want to spotlight the resources that we have made available for prospective applicants. So this, today's general information session, as I noted at the top of the session, will be recorded and posted to our digital justice supplementary materials page for folks to view and share. The office hour sessions with ACLS staff, which will both be in October, will primarily function as an opportunity to get more information about program parameters and also to ask specific questions related to your project. If you're also having any kind of like difficulty navigating the ACLS online application portal, that's a great opportunity to kind of pop in and get your question answered. So given the informal nature of those, they are, quite literally like office hours in the name. You can feel free to pop in and out and get your questions answered, or you can stay for the entire session. We don't record those sessions and post them online since people obviously will be discussing their applications and we want to respect folks' privacy. So I'm going to ask my colleague Katie to pop the link to register for those sessions in the chat, just so that you have it for your reference. And we hope to see you there. So unfortunately, given our staffing capacity, we are a small but mighty team of 2. We cannot offer individual phone or Zoom consultations to prospective applicants. So I really encourage you to attend one of those office hours if you're able to. And especially if you have specific questions about your project, the office hours are a great opportunity to get virtual FaceTime, right? Otherwise, you can feel free to send us an email at digitaljustice@acls.org. As I said, we are a small team of 2, so we appreciate and thank you in advance for your patience and grace in terms of the turnaround time, especially during this time of the year. We receive, at this point, hundreds of emails about the program, so we try to be thoughtful also in how we respond to them. So the next resource I'd like to direct you to is the supplementary materials page on the ACLS Digital Justice webpage. And I'm also going to ask Katie can insert that link in the chat so folks are able to take a look at it. There you'll find a couple of things. So you will find examples of applications that were funded in 2025. So some of our recent grantees were gracious enough to give us permission to post their materials. So you have concrete examples of not only how folks framed and discussed their projects, but also how they navigated the prompt application structure. So the project I discussed earlier in the session, the Archaeological Archives as Inclusive Learning Laboratories, is one such sample application. I recommend looking through them so you can see how that project team effectively used things like the appendix, or what their letters of support from community partners look like, or even how granular their budgets and timelines were. You can also see examples of how they cited other scholarship given the new format. You'll also find a budget template that we encourage applicants to use and submit with the application, as well as a wide variety of recordings and transcripts from the webinars that we have done from previous competition cycles. So last year's sessions on data stewardship, privacy, and capacity building, as well as the 2024 sessions on digital platforms, tools, and methods, on cultivating community partnerships around digital projects, as well as operationalizing digital humanities projects, are still relevant now, and will help you think about how to best frame your project for the application. So here also is the link to that page for your reference once again. So the last topic that I'll cover for today is the competition timeline, so that these dates are on your radar. So the most obvious date is the deadline for applications, which is a little earlier than previous years. It's November 3rd, 2026 at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So we did open the competition a little earlier than we historically have. So it's been open since early August, and we have our deadline for early November, largely just to try to accommodate and anticipate the volume of applications that, again, has steadily grown over the past couple of years. And so staff need more time to process those applications and assign those applications to reviewers. So after this date and time, our online fellowship application will no longer allow for submissions. And unfortunately, we do not allow for extensions of any kind. So you must, and I said this, you must submit your application, through our online fellowship application portal. We can accept applications sent by email. So if you send us your materials via email, even if it's before the deadline, and you don't submit them via the portal, your application will not be eligible for review. So please make sure that you submit on time. I recommend, if you can, to submit at least a day or two before the deadline, just in case if you run into any technical difficulties, you can send us an email, we can get you the help you need, so that way you are able to submit on time. So this date, November 3rd, is also the deadline by which the administrators at your respective institutions should submit their institutional verification. So if you are applying, as I said earlier, you should register in the application portal as soon as possible so that you can submit your administrator's email address, and our portal will send them the instructions on how to submit the verification form. I'm hammering down on this point because every year there is a good chunk of applications where the applicant submits all of the materials, the project team, they've done all that they needed to do, but they did not get their verification form submitted in time. And so I just want to offer that as a word of caution to try to make sure that that is submitted by the deadline as well. So the program has received a steady increase of volume of applications over the past 3 cycles, which is why we have instituted an additional round of review. And so the results of that first round of review will be shared in February, February of 2027, followed by the results of the final round of review in April 2027. And so now that I have gone through kind of the program parameters, the difference between the seed and development grants, as well as the application components and those kind of key dates to keep on your radar, I am going to look into the Q&A, and we can spend the next 10 minutes or so answering folks' questions. All right, so I will ask this one or answer this one. So I would like to know if your program has any suggestions for applicants about how and or where to source funds to pay for indirect costs. If there are any examples you can provide from past projects, that would be great. So unfortunately, this program does not support indirect costs. It's not something that the grant covers. And so in that instance, we do offer we encourage folks to think about the labor, for example, that goes into the project as part of the direct cost. So that is something that we do allow. In that way, you're able to write in certain percentages of your salary, certain percentages of fringe benefits in terms of the amount of time that you believe will be necessary to actually sort of complete the project. But in terms of admin overhead, again, I'm sorry, that is not something that the program supports. But if you're thinking also about kind of space that you may need to use on campus for the work of the project, you can certainly write that in as a direct cost as well. And for supplies, things like subscription, all those things that might in some other budgets be folded as admin overhead, you can certainly sort of reach out to us and we can talk about whether or not that can be folded into the direct cost of the project. But in terms of other ways to fund those indirect costs, that is not something, I'm sorry, that's within the purview of the program. So the next question, does the deliverable need to be in English, or can it be in a different language directed to the immigrant community involved? Great question. So I think ultimately, whatever relationship you have with your community partners is going to inform the thing that you are co-creating with them, right? And so if it is the case that this project is emerging from community needs and community is involved in creating it, it would make sense that it would be in the language that's most accessible to that community. I think that given the kinds of priorities that reviewers have in the past expressed around exactly this kind of thing, it would be well received. I would also note, though, that in terms of, I guess, thinking about various scales of impact of the project, obviously the impact for the community partners is the most immediate, but then also if you want this work to be accessible to other scholars doing similar kind of work, whether or not having that deliverable, a version of it also exists in English, or another language that people can access is something to consider. But to answer your question, no, the deliverable itself does not need to be in English. That is not something that would make the project ineligible for consideration or ineligible for funding. All right, the next question. So given how you described the community support partnership letters, does not having community support letters impact your application negatively? So this is a question that we receive every year. And as a first matter, of course, I would direct folks to look at the webinar that we did on cultivating community partnerships a couple of years ago to give you a sense of kind of, what that entails in terms of operationalizing community partnerships within digital projects, but also giving you a sense of the kinds of considerations that reviewers have historically sort of thought about and considered when they're evaluating an application. So on the one hand, not having a community partner does not make your project ineligible, right? You can still submit it, it will still be reviewed, if it adheres to the other eligibility requirements. The extent to which those community partners are not involved in a project about them, I think does elicit some questions about the nature of the project and why those communities are not involved in the project, right? So if you're trying to sort of think about the ways that folks may read your application, you can begin to think about the kinds of questions that they would ask in the absence of that letter, right? And so I don't want to sort of say that not having a community partner categorically, makes a project unsuccessful or will make a project unsuccessful. But I will say that if, again, given the thematic focus of the program, which is about funding projects that center and critically engage with historically marginalized communities, if you are doing a project that does that, but those partners are not present, you then have to kind of explain why. And that can have everything to do with kind of where you are in the project life cycle. But it is something that I think it's a question to really kind of wrestle with and grapple with in the application. How would you describe the typical minimum scale of awarded recipients of development funds? The example projects were quite large in terms of volume and geographic scope. I'm sorry, I don't know that I quite understand what you mean by scale. Do you mean project size, project sort of like the duration of the project, how long it's lasts? If you could provide a little bit more details about what you mean by scale, I think I can give a better example, or I can better answer your question. So I'm sorry about that. All right, so I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So this one, our project is an initiative that aims to analyze the content of a form of advocacy called video mitigation, short documentaries that are created by filmmakers and lawyers and used as a part of the defense team's negotiating packet. Part of our work is the anonymization, coding, and analysis of the resulting transcript. While the content of the videos themselves is sensitive, the resulting analysis and process documentation would be made public. Does this type of process and usage qualify for this type of grant? I would say so. I think I would need more information about the specific types of documentaries in terms of the content or the subject matter. But the description of this reminds me of a project that received a digital justice seed and development grant that did similar kind of work in terms of kind of extracting sensitive information from an apartheid archive or an archive in South Africa that housed anti-apartheid letters. And so obviously the contents of the archive itself is sensitive, and the whole point of the project is to protect the identities of those who are in the archive while still thinking of ways to make the archive accessible to researchers. And so the workflow and the process documentation is the thing that was the sort of resulting deliverable. So what you describe reminds me of that, but again, I think I need more information about the types of documentaries, the content of them, and also I think what sort of what I guess disciplinarily, what disciplines would you be engaging with in doing that work as well. So this is exactly the kind of question where if you have more specific sort of details about your project, you can send those over to our inbox or come to the office hours where you can kind of talk a little bit more extensively about what it is you're thinking about and working through, and we can kind of think together about an answer for that. Oh, I see. So thank you for following up, Omaris Zamora. So they noted that, for example, we work with featuring community organizations, people in our project, but they are not a PI per se. And so again, the PI designation is an interesting one. The community partners don't have to be PIs per se, because again, that helps us, one, to understand how we are distributing funds, and also in terms of reporting, who's responsible for the kind of relationship management with ACLS. But if you're working with community organizations, there still should at the very least be someone who can write a letter on your behalf about how that community organization is sort of participating in the project. And so I want to kind of clarify that distinction of community partner can function as a co-PI on the project or not, right? And so if they're not a co-PI on the project, that doesn't necessarily preclude them from being able to submit a letter of support, kind of detailing their contributions to the project. All right, so then I think I'll try to answer one more since we're at 2:55. This one is for those of us joining project teams from the humanistic social sciences, what are the most effective ways of communicating our humanistic intellectual approaches and practices beyond just our scholarly records? I think that's a great question. You can look to some application components to kind of do that work for you in terms of what disciplines or subfields the project is situated within. So for example, something like the bibliography is really, really critical in that regard. I want everyone to treat every part of the application with a degree of intentionality, but the bibliography does flag to reviewers kind of who you're reading, who you feel that this project is engaged with, who it's speaking to, what kind of disciplines or subfields it's kind of contributing to. So think about the bibliography as a way of kind of doing that, of positioning, your project in that way. But also as you talk about the sort of project overview and the project history, right? That is a moment where you can cite different scholarly sort of monographs, articles, conferences, et cetera, to sort of foreground the contribution, the intellectual contribution that your project is offering. And so you can think of those two spaces as ways of placing your work in conversation with humanistic intellectual approaches. All right, so I think I will put a pin in it there because I'm not quite sure about the last question. But again, if folks have additional questions, they can email us at digitaljustice@acls.org. Also, please feel free to pop into our office hours in October, where you can just sort of have more conversation with me about your project, or sort of if you have questions about navigating the application or, how to sort of frame things. I'm always happy to provide some insight and some help. It was a pleasure engaging with you all this afternoon. I want to wish you all the best of luck on your application. As I noted at the top of the session, this will be the last digital justice competition. And so I am very eager to kind of see what new applications and what new projects folks will propose. But again, best of luck. And if you have any additional questions, please email us at digitaljustice@acls.org.